So, welcome everybody to Modern Day Debate. Very excited and happy New Year's as we are in New Year's Eve and we're addicted. We just can't get enough of this. Basically, we are here to have another debate, and the reason is, like we said, we're addicted. We can't get enough of it, and we hope that you can't get enough of it either. We're excited for your questions at the end, and you can shoot those questions that you have for the Q&A into the comments. Those will be collected by who is going to be our moderator in just a couple of minutes, Jonathan from Anchored Alliance Evangelism, as I jump into the lion's den, and I will be defending the claim that Christianity has more evidence than other religions, which is going to be a lot of fun, and a few house cleaning things right at the start. One, if you have not heard about it, I don't know how you haven't heard, because I've been talking about it nonstop, because we're stoked about the debate tomorrow, January 1st, 2019, between Kent Hovind and Inspiring Philosophy on whether or not evolution can fit within the Bible. This is going to be epic, off the charts. We're amped, we're stoked. So, in addition to that, we have a lot of other debates coming up. So, if you are new here, we're glad you're here. Hit that subscribe button for reminders as well as that bell notification, so that way you know when we have more new live debates on religion and atheism in the future. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John, and then I'll jump back in to do a couple more house cleaning type things right before we go into Q&A. But in the meantime, I'm going to the lion's den to defend my claim against our two skeptical friends here tonight. John, if you want to let everybody introduce themselves, I'll pass that part on to you. So John, I'll introduce you and just say, if you guys have not heard of John's channel, Anchored Alliance Evangelism is a awesome channel. Down in the description, there's a link for it. Check it out. Even if you don't agree with him, even if you say, hey, I can't stand John, you're going to love him. So go click on his link, check him out. Even if you don't agree with him, you at least heard it straight from his mouth, his view in particular. So John, thanks for coming here and moderating tonight.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me here. Really excited to get started with everything. Of course, be sure to come by tomorrow night and know that we will have many debates in the near future. First thing I'll say, just as a quick introduction, we got TJump and Joseph here. We'll let them both introduce themselves, but you can find both of their channels and Joseph's Twitter and TJump's channel in the description below, so be sure to check that out and see what's going on right there. And if you have any questions during the debate that you want for the Q&A, please tag Anchored Alliance Evangelism in it if you want me to take down the question to ask to them later on. So without any further ado, let's turn it over first to Tom and then to Joseph. So we'll start that right now.
Hey, I'm an atheist, and by atheist, what I mean is I believe there is no evidence to indicate belief in a God at all. And I do debates on this topic on my channel, and I actually have a debate coming up with Kent Hovind as well on the 16th. That'll be pretty exciting.
Yes, indeed. And now we will go to Joseph. So feel free to introduce yourself, my man.
Well, I'm more of an agnostic. I'm of the assumption that there isn't a lot of evidence behind the Bible, at least no more than any other religion. So I'm more or less here to hear people's thoughts, maybe refute some things.
Well, oh, sorry. Keep going, man.
Yeah, you're fine. Yeah, that's it.
All right. Well, you know what? With all that in mind, I think the best thing to do is just to get this debate started. And the best way to do that will be to turn it over to James initially to defend this claim, and then we'll just get into a lot of the cross-examination after that point in time. And last thing, if you do want to be on this channel at any point in time, just tag Modern Day Debate in any kind of post or go to his email, and we can start getting that set up. The calendar's getting real full, but we always have room for a little bit more, so feel free to hit him up for that. And with all that being said, we'll let James get started right now. And Happy New Year to everyone, by the way. Thank you so much for being here. We're very happy to have you here for that. So now we'll turn it over to James, and I will step out of the way.
Well, I'm stoked to be here, as mentioned, and not only because it's New Year's Eve, this is the way we party on New Year's Eve here at Modern Day Debate, but also because I'm bringing a different kind of argument tonight, in the sense that, you know, sometimes we kind of have our own arguments, and that's okay. Like, sometimes people come up with their own arguments that are pretty solid, But I'm excited to bring to you tonight an argument from scholars so that you can know that this is actually something that, as mentioned, an argument doesn't have to be from scholars to be good, but it's a good sign that it's at least worth considering seriously, right? If the people who study it all their lives, or in some cases all their lives, 8 hours a day, that's really significant. And a lot of scholars actually find this argument to be quite persuasive. In particular, by the way, it's not usually this loud. I had a Wi-Fi challenge and had to come to McDonald's to use the Wi-Fi. So thanks for your patience on that. We're going to make it through. So the argument for the resurrection of Jesus based on historical data, I think, is actually a compelling argument for Christianity. Now, even if you didn't think this argument is compelling, my hope is that at least the other two that I'm facing tonight in this debate would agree that it's extremely unlikely that every religion has the exact same amount of evidence. That even if you think that each one deserves like less than 5 probability points each, you'd probably say like one of them, you know, maybe one religion gets 1% probability, and another one you're like, well, that one's a little bit more likely. I give it like a 3% or a 5%, something like that. If you give it a small percent, you'd probably admit that just by random chance, some religions are going to appear to have more evidence than others, right? I mean, it would seem like just a statistical anomaly if all religions had the exact same amount of evidence. I just want to point that out because a lot of times people just say like, oh, no, they all just have the exact same amount. And I wouldn't say my opponents say that, but it's something I want to address because I hear it sometimes in other places. So with regards to the evidence for Jesus' resurrection, I'm just going to lay out the very broad bones because the goal of the Lion's Den debate is that I will explain my position for like maybe 5 minutes, and then the Lions will pounce and they will give their toughest objections, and I will attempt to defend it. So I can unpack it as the questions come. The first, I'll basically say first that this is an inductive argument, which basically just means that we're taking these smaller data points and we're arguing for a broader conclusion. And in particular, these are smaller data points, historically speaking, that we would say the broader conclusion is that we would say these data points are best explained by the idea that Jesus was risen from the dead by God the Father. And so these data points are 3. One is that on different occasions and in different places, both individuals and even groups had experiences of Jesus resurrected. So this is, by the way, all 3 of these facts that I'm going to explain are agreed upon by the majority of New Testament scholars. And so these aren't just Christians. Some of them are Jewish, some of them are atheists. They're from different worldviews, but the majority of them from the field agree on these. The second fact is that the tomb that Jesus was buried in was found empty 3 days after his burial. And that's significant because if he resurrected, obviously you'd have to have an empty tomb. Otherwise, you couldn't claim that he really rose from the dead because he would still be sitting dead in the tomb. And I can give some of the different data points for this as the Lions ask their questions. But again, this second fact also is agreed upon by the majority of scholars. And the last one is the origin of the disciples' belief. This is just the idea that scholars agree across the board that the Christians in the first century, early first century, so roughly around the year 30 AD, you had these different, basically you had, you could say that the earliest Christians were struck with an idea that Jesus arose. And this fact as well is best explained by the idea that he actually did rise. And there are a couple of reasons. One is using the criterion of dissimilarity. And this is a criterion that even non-Christian scholars like atheist Bart Ehrman would use. And this criterion of dissimilarity is just that the idea is, it's not a Jewish idea, obviously. In other words, the Christians coming up with this idea that the Jesus is the Messiah who is coming and going to die for the sins of the world was not the idea of the Jewish Messiah of the Old Testament, which was instead the idea was that you would have this military conqueror that would come. So it's different from prior Judaism, and it's also not explained by the early church because they were the early church. There's nobody else that could have influenced them to give them this idea that they were the first Christians. And so this has to be explained in some other way rather than Christian tradition from the early church, and it also has to be explained, as mentioned, as an alternative to, or in other words, it can't be explained by prior Judaistic history. So with that, I will, just as mentioned, I've explained those three facts are agreed upon, and they're best explained by Jesus' resurrection. We don't have another natural explanation that explains them well. And more importantly, for our broader question for this debate, we don't have other religions that have this powerful of a historical case or a miracle, and more importantly, the central miracle of their faith, which is the resurrection for Christians. So that was at least 5 or 10 minutes. I will kick it over to the Lions. So thanks for your patience.
All right, if you don't mind, I'll start. So even though the facts that you mentioned are agreed upon by historians, most biblical scholars and historians consider the study of miracle claims to lie outside of the bounds of historians acting within their professional capacity. So most historians and biblical scholars completely dismiss that as having anything to do with miracles. Those are natural occurrences, and natural explanations are always better than any supernatural explanation. So I'm not sure what you mean when you say we don't have a natural explanation of those things. Maybe we don't have a particular natural explanation, but just saying it could be some combination of delusion, illusion, misconception, those things are always more plausible than a resurrection actually occurring, because we don't have any empirical evidence of resurrections occurring. It's no different from unicorns or miracles or magic or mythical creatures. We just don't have a basis for that. So what would be your response to that? That most biblical scholars and historians hold to the investigation of miracles lies outside of the bounds of a historian acting within their professional capacity.
Yeah, glad you asked. So the trick is we distinguish between methodological naturalism as well as metaphysical naturalism by distinction. And the idea is, it's true that we can, and I think it's, you could say, we either adopt naturalistic assumptions when we do our science or historiography, or we might adopt instead almost naturalism, the idea that we think that miracles are virtually never occurring. And so it's true that historians would say we do it in a way that's methodologically naturalistic. We say, like, we're not looking for a miraculous answer. But this isn't purely like a historical debate. So tonight, my broader case is a more philosophical case. And so I'm saying that now we could go to more directly addressing your point. I think you were saying, well, but a miracle is by definition the least probable thing that would occur, if I understand right. You want to clarify for me? Sorry, I didn't mean to butcher you there. Go ahead.
All right, so you mentioned that this was a historical argument based on authorities. Well, the authorities, majority of the authorities agree none of this qualifies as evidence of a God. This is all just, there are some natural historical events that occurred, and none of it applies for evidence of any kind of supernatural. And the reason isn't because we're assuming naturalism. The reason is because of induction. We're only allowed to use, to infer things that have an inductive basis of having happened in the past. And since we can't verify any miracles or magic or mythical creatures or paranormal or supernatural or UFOs happened in the past, they can't be used as inferences to explanations of historical events because they don't have an empirical basis.
I think I understand what you're saying. So, and that would be similar to my first response would just be that I don't think we actually should. Well, there are two issues here. There's one is whether or not we can give a supernatural, like, can we draw a supernatural conclusion versus, well, my question is there any sort of evidence, because this will kind of help us understand if we're maybe going to run around in circles. Is there anything that could convince you that there is a God that exists based on historical or anything material, like anything that could be empirically verified?
Yes, empirically verified, yes. Historical, no. Historical, most of the historical things can't be empirically verified. But there are certain qualifications I have to that, like an all-powerful being. There's nothing empirical that would demonstrate something is all-powerful, because that would require infinitely many empirical tests. But there would, if you could make testable predictions, like if I prayed to a god and got a gold brick every time, that would be sufficient to get me to believe there is some kind of a supernatural being that can grant wishes or has certain powers.
Okay, so my question is, so it seems to be that it's repeatable. That seems to be the most important component, right?
Future testable predictions, yes, they do have to be repeatable.
Okay. So, yeah, I think we just have different standards there. I mean, for me, I think we can both think of like thought experiments, and maybe you're willing to bite the bullet, but like, let's say I were to pray for like a single instant I just, like, right now I said, like, God, if you really, really are real, would you just show yourself in the form of, would you have, let's say a mailman walk through the door and walk over to the table and do like 10 jumping jacks and then, do what appears to be a miracle, like while I'm here at McDonald's, like, and then let's say it happened. And it was like, oh my gosh, that might be evidence, right? But then I say, well, but if it doesn't happen a second time, I won't believe it. Like, you see how that's like a hard pill to swallow. Like, most of us would think, like, whoa, come on, like that. There's no way that was a coincidence. Either, maybe he heard, well, if it's a prayer in my head, let's say he wouldn't have been able to hear it, and we would think, probably reasonably, we would think maybe there is like a supernatural thing here that just answered that prayer. Are you willing to bite the bullet on that?
Well, no, I think science has already answered that question, is that has to be done repeatably and testably, and has to be confirmed by peer review, which means other people have to be able to use the same explanation to make other testable predictions that they can verify independently. Because the human mind is so fallible that we can't just depend on some event happening once, because coincidences happen all the time. So we need that verifiability, the repeatability, the independent verifiability is necessary for it to be reasonable to believe it indicates something that exists in the world, and your personal experience is not sufficient.
Yeah, so my thought is that we just have different, like, disagreeing. I don't think we have to apply scientism. Like, I'm not, do you adhere to scientism, namely the idea that we can only know things if they are scientifically demonstrated?
No, we can only know things about the world that have empirical verifiability. We can only know empirical things with empirical evidence. We can know conceptual things like math and logic without science at all. We have no need to reference science into conceptual things. So scientism is the claim that only through science can we gain knowledge. Now, my claim is not that. My claim is that we can only gain knowledge about the external world through science, as far as we know. There could be other methods that we haven't discovered yet, but science is the only one I know of that gives us information about the external world and what actually exists.
Okay, so if God is beyond the external world in the sense that God is immaterial, like an incorporeal mind, then it seems like he would be an exception to your rule.
Well, I'm not saying nothing exists if it can't be scientifically verified. I'm saying we only have reason to believe those things that can be scientifically verified do exist. Like, if there is something outside of the scientific method, then as far as I know, there is no way to differentiate that thing from just one of the infinitely many imaginary things that could also exist in its place. And since there's no way to differentiate between imaginary things and this existing thing, then we have no reason to believe it is anything but an imaginary thing.
So nothing historically could make you think that there was any evidence, like not even one probability point, based on your standard, the epistemology you just explained. Nothing, historically speaking, could ever even make you increase in your probability, like by 1 percentage point for a particular religion, correct?
Unless history had future predictions, that would be good enough. But if just accounting from historical testimony, no amount of historical testimony would ever be sufficient.
Okay, so we really just have different standards of epistemology. I'm curious why you take this, what seems to be idiosyncratic kind of epistemology. Like, why is this approach better than, because I think a lot of people would. I think even skeptics like maybe Richard Dawkins or others, I would think would probably say, well, is there, they might say, are there things that historically would make them believe? I think that there are a lot of atheists that would say yes. So I'm kind of curious, why do you take this unique path? I've never heard this before.
Well, as far as I know, it's actually the consensus among historians and biblical scholars. I actually have a paper pulled up right now by Mike Lacona, and the first line is, most biblical scholars and historians hold to the investigation of miracle report lies outside of the rights of historians acting within their professional capacity. And then he lists a bunch of historians who hold this position, and he goes through their arguments, and they're listed on the paper explicitly saying exactly this, that history isn't in the business of supposing metaphysical things like miracles exist. They're just outside of the bounds of history completely. So nothing in history can ever indicate those things. That is the consensus in academic historians and biblical scholars.
I think, but we're like ships crossing in the night, in the sense that, like I already explained, Tom, that I'm not saying that purely based on like historical methods alone. This is an inductive argument, namely a philosophical argument. And so we're not bound to have to apply the historical criteria of saying what you had just explained in that quote to every case in the world, or I should say, at least to this case, I should say in particular. Because, like I said, this is a philosophical argument for a particular religion, and so it seems like you're applying it, you could say, like standards of historical methodology to philosophy, which it just seems, I don't understand why. It seems unjustified.
Well, I agree with like what you said in the beginning. There are professionals who work on this 8 hours a day, and most of the consensus in philosophy is also a naturalist philosophy that we can't infer to things like miracles. So the academic consensus of the people who work on this professionally seem to all agree miracles is not within the bounds of what history can identify or what philosophy can identify. You need empirical evidence. And the reason for this is that because there is no way to differentiate between that supposed thing, miracles, and just an imaginary thing. Like we could say there are infinitely many ways to explain anything. One event, like say some miraculous supposed event, maybe that was caused by a miracle, but it could also have been caused by unicorns or leprechauns or genies or any number of things, or it could have just been an unknown natural thing. And there's no way to differentiate between miracles and all those other just imaginary things. And until you can come up with the criteria for that, we can just dismiss miracles as just another one of the imaginary things. And that's what the empirical method does. It gives us a way to differentiate between just an imaginary thing and something we have reason to believe exists. So that's why I adopt the empirical methodology.
Yeah, so let me note one disagreement that we have. So it's true that the majority of philosophers are naturalists. However, if you look more narrowly at the ones that actually specialize within the realm of philosophy of religion, namely the topic we're discussing, most of them are not naturalists. Most of them are theists. In other words, so a lot of philosophers, they can be naturalists. Oh, this is according to the David Chalmers survey, which is, I'm thinking you must be familiar with. I didn't hear you cite a source, but mine is from the actual Chalmers study. And in that, it actually showed that it was roughly 70% of theists from philosophy of religion actually do believe in a God. So again, this just seems arbitrary to apply this naturalistic historical criteria to a realm that is not holding that sort of naturalistic, those sort of assumptions.
Well, I don't mean to sound derogatory when I say this, but most homeopaths believe in homeopathy. So the fact that most religious theologists are religious doesn't really sound surprising, but I don't think that is in any way a justifiable reason to take their ideas seriously, just because most religious people go into religious theology and most atheists don't because they don't have an interest in it.
Well, hold on a second. There's a couple of things here. There's several issues. One is, I didn't bring this up as a case for like theism. You brought this up as a case of trying to justify your pulling naturalism with regards to its assumptions and historical methodology into philosophy, because I said this is a historical argument, not, or I should say this is a philosophical argument is what I said, not a historical one. And you had said, if it sounded right to me, roughly speaking, you had said, well, not only is this an assumption among historians that we can't be like be open or consider miracles, or that we should at least take them as like maybe plausibly true, whichever way I can let you correct me on how you want to state it, because I know I'm not stating that quite in the best way. I don't want to be charitable, but you had brought it up as saying, oh, well, wait a minute, look at philosophers, very naturalistic. And I'm saying, but if you look at the specialists in this particular field. But the second thing is, you said people who believe in homeopathy. There's one thing is, first of all, they're not, I think you said something about theologians, is that these are like philosophers that, now it's true, some of them probably do theology as well, but some of them are atheists. Like I think roughly like 30% of them are atheists. And so you might say, I think you suggested there's a selection effect, namely that, well, if you have them like basically like maybe Christians or people who believe in a God already, they would be drawn to, you know, philosophy of religion. But the unfortunate thing is, according to the Chalmers survey, we don't see that in other cases. So for example, like when we look at if people are moral realists in metaphysics or metaethics, we actually find that it's actually the opposite. In other words, it's disproportionately not, people do not believe in objective moral values as a part of reality, generally speaking, among metaethicists that specialize in it. So in other words, you would expect that if people who would be most interested in like, oh, the idea of objective morality, they would maybe be drawn to it. We see the opposite. And it's the same for aesthetics too, is that the evidence.
quite see your connection there, because in regards to aesthetics and morality, you can believe in those things as being objective, independent of a god or theology or any kind of supernatural. So we wouldn't expect to see a disproportionate selection effect in those cases where we would in religion, because it's specifically related to religion. And if people think religion is false or pseudoscience, they're probably not going to go into it as much.
Well, hold on. I think I roughly stated it, and that's my fault. What I'm not trying to say that if you look at, let's say, people who specialize in metaethics, when we do look at people who specialize in metaethics, I'm not saying that they are disproportionately less likely to believe in God. I can see why you'd think that I was saying that, but I just was poorly stated on my part. What I was trying to say is that when you look at people who specialize in metaethics and who like research whether or not, let's say, ethics is objective, most of them do not believe in objective ethics. And you say that you see that the same in aesthetics, whether or not aesthetics are objective or not, and like whether or not things are actually objectively beautiful, is that when you look at the specialists in that area, it's actually disproportionately lower in terms of their belief of these objective truths about aesthetics. And so my only point is that when we look elsewhere in the survey, we actually don't see this type of selection effect, because you would expect that by your reasoning, people who would be like, oh, I'm really interested in the idea of objective morality, like objective ethics, that draws me, you think there'd be a selection effect there too, but we don't see it. In other words, I'm saying that
I don't think so, because ethics doesn't only apply to objective ethics. There are lots of different kinds of ethics that are not objective. So there's lots of things in the field of ethics to interest people who are not specifically interested in objective ethics. Whereas in the philosophy of religion, it is specifically about religion. So if you aren't interested in religion, you're probably not going to go into the philosophy of religion.
No, that's false. So for example, like if you look at the problem of evil, like that's an argument for philosophical atheism or scholarly atheism, the proposition that there is no God. That has nothing to do with religion, because people would say, most atheists would say that atheism itself is not a religion. And so you could look at the incoherence of theism arguments. The arguments, so for example, when you try to pit like God's omnipotence against his omniscience, is those arguments are attempts at, you could say, proving or showing atheism to be true. In reality, though, like that's not a religion. Atheism is not a religion. So in other words, in philosophy of religion, it's not just arguments for God's existence or for a religion. And not only that, but a lot of arguments for God's existence aren't even for a particular religion. So it's not like that would have to necessarily influence it either. So do you understand what I mean with the problem of evil? Like philosophy of religion is not just arguments for religion or God, it's also arguments for atheism.
Yes, that's true, but in ethics is a much more broad field. So again, my main point is that most philosophers are naturalists. They do not consider history or philosophy to be reasonable indicators of miracles. There definitely is a subsect of the philosophy of religion where the majority of them are religious and they do believe that, but most philosophers don't. Most philosophers reject that. And the reason is because there's no way to differentiate between miracles and any other imaginary thing that we can make up. That's the fundamental reason behind it, as far as we can tell. There is no methodology to differentiate between miracles and just another imaginary thing.
Well, hold on. Going back to my argument, though, you just said that, well, but there's a lot of other things you can study in ethics as opposed to philosophy of religion, and was just broader. You just asserted it arbitrarily. Like you didn't give any reasons. You didn't, whether they be abstract or empirical. You didn't give any sort of like pure, like you just asserted it. This just seems arbitrary to me. It just seems like you're conveniently just stating it and assuming I'll take it as true, when in actuality in philosophy of religion, like there's the idea of like religious experience and not necessarily theistic types, because certain forms of Buddhism, for example, have religious experience even though it's atheistic as a worldview or philosophy. So to me, it just, I'm not sure if you're, especially if you thought originally that philosophy of religion didn't have these atheist components that you could be interested in. I'm like, just saying that morality is just more broad, I don't find that persuasive at all. But if you want to go back to your main point, we can. I think that if we've talked about authorities, we've talked about, and not in an unreasonable way, like I think it's important to consult authorities. But your main argument is, I'm not sure. So it sounds like, if I can understand you right, maybe if I, let's say, leave the historical argument behind, maybe if I gave you, because I don't, curious, would you ever think that, do you think, so you would grant, though, that some atheists would take historical arguments as potentially being evidence for a religion, right?
Possibly, but I'd say most probably not. The vast
Okay.
majority, I'd say probably not.
Gotcha.
There could always be a few.
Okay, fair enough. And let's say, for the sake of arguing, because I think we disagree on whether or not, we disagree on that epistemology, let's just say that. Maybe there's another argument that I could try to use that's not historical. So I can kind of try to defer to you for the sake of argument. Let's say I say that your epistemology is that, like we take it and we say it's solid and it's the ideal way to go. If we do that, for the sake of argument, what kind of evidence might persuade you? And maybe I'll try to switch my case up.
Future testable predictions.
Gotcha. And that's for believing in something that that would be the criteria for believing in a God in particular.
Anything. It's just we start with, there is some difference between our imagination and our experience, and we need some criteria to differentiate between the two. And that criteria is science or future testable predictions. So we need the future testable predictions to show that there is something that exists in the world and isn't just a part of our imagination.
Gotcha. So we can, how about this? Because let's everybody try to remember that point. And what I want to do just really quick is, because the other lion, Joseph, hasn't talked a lot, and he's been standing incredibly still this whole conversation. Joseph, you haven't even blinked, buddy. I'm just kidding. It's a picture of him. But Joseph, do you have any ideas or objections or anything that you'd want to share as well? And then we can come back to this issue too.
Well, I would like to go back to your argument about probabilities. What exactly did you mean by that? Because before we get into that, we have to be able to prove that something's even possible before we can go into an argument about whether or not something is probable. And then if you want to apply that historically, you first have to somehow demonstrate that it's possible to happen in the here and now. So what evidence do you have to support your hypothesis that this happened historically?
I think that you're asking for what evidence do I have to think that the broader conclusion happened historically, correct?
Yes, either that or any specific case of anything Jesus supposedly did in the Bible, or any sort of miracle that you claim to have happened at one point in history. We have to first prove that it's possible.
Okay, and by possible, I think you're meaning like we should have some reason to believe that miracles are possible, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay. And I do think that there are arguments for thinking that there is a God that probably exists. And we can give those, but that would be, because I think it is a cumulative case is the most ideal case for, you could say, setting up the historical argument. And in that case, so for example, like if we talked about the argument from objective morality, or if we talked about, I'd be willing to say that I think that the argument based on objective moral values for God's existence is sound. I think it's.
How does that show miracles are possible?
Yes, exactly.
So if there is a God who is, okay, yeah. So I see what you mean, where you say at that point we'd only have a God that's good, but it wouldn't show that the God could interfere with the world. I think that's what you're saying?
Well, I suppose the easiest way to verify that there could be a God and that there could be miracles is to have a testable prediction about whether or not this God could influence reality. Even if it was through some supernatural means, you would be able to detect the effect on reality at the very least.
Okay, so if I understand right, now you're moving into more, it sounds potentially like scientism or some variation of it.
It seems like he's making the same argument I am, and that's definitely not scientism, because scientism says that's the only way to know anything, and he definitely did not say that. He just said, I want to know miracles are possible, and the way to do that would be testable predictions.
Right, yeah, except that I don't see why we are applying this only accepting scientific testable predictions as being the only way we could know a God exists. It just seems arbitrary to me that you guys are applying this standard where I doubt you apply it consistently.
Well, if you refuse to go down that road and you just have nothing but a philosophical argument. It's been shown time and again with a lot of philosophers that they'll try to talk their way into proving anything if you just want to use a philosophical argument. So you can't really rely on just philosophy to prove or disprove a God. You would have to have some sort of testable predictions you could make. You would have to see some sort of effect on reality. You'd have to you'd have to have a coherent answer as to why you believe it, rather than just a philosophical one.
But would you maintain that philosophical answers couldn't be coherent? Like none of them?
No, they could be if you could actually see how it is true right now.
You mean empirically?
Yeah, I guess so.
If you mind, let me take it from there. So the reason we need testable predictions is because there are infinitely many ways to explain anything, and all of them except one are imaginary. So we need some criteria to filter out the imaginary. And the empirical predictions is the only way I know of that can filter out the imaginary things reliably. Every other criteria you come up with is going to allow infinitely many imaginary things to get through past that criterion. So we need the testable predictions to filter out the imaginary explanations.
So I think we talked about this once before, though, that this standard, like if we're going to be consistently applying it, how do we, for example, like how do you empirically test that the laws of logic will apply in the future? Like how do you know that even that the future will be like the past? Like you actually couldn't repeat that itself. Like, and that's why I don't understand you're applying this like epistemology where you clearly wouldn't in other cases. It seems arbitrary. It seems like you're just raising the bar so high on, you know, the evidence for a particular religion or a God, and I don't see why you're raising it higher than you would for other beliefs or ideas.
Well, I apply this to everything. I'm completely consistent. I apply this to absolutely everything. In the case of logic, logic is conceptual. It's something we know in our head, so we don't need empirical evidence for it. If I said a bachelor is an unmarried man, I don't need to empirically prove that. It's just true by definition. It's something in our heads. Logic and math is likewise something in our heads that we use to analyze the world or to compare relations in the world. It isn't an actually existing thing.
Okay, so, but what if we use Hume's law of induction, like we talk about like the potential problem of induction, and we say, well, in the past it's always been true that it's, you know, that was the way the world worked with regard to logic or whatever else, but we don't know that the future will be that way. How do we know that the future will be that way?
We don't. That's metaphysics. Those are the absolute certainty questions that we don't have answers to. Science doesn't give us an answer to those questions at all. It just gives us a way to differentiate between the imaginary explanations and the ones that are reasonable to believe. It doesn't even attempt to answer those questions.
Sure, but don't you realize that science, so this would undermine your own epistemology, though, in that science relies on things being the same in the future as they were in the past, because otherwise when you do test something and you find that it happened the same way in the future, or I should say in the present, compared to the way it happened in the past, you wouldn't...
Science makes predictions. It doesn't say with absolute certainty that what happened before is going to happen next. It just makes predictions. It's been pretty reliable so far in proving whether or not, well, proving is a bad word to use in anything but math, but more or less it has proven pretty successful so far at understanding the world.
Well, no, well, hold on a second, though. For Hume's law of induction, what I'm saying, though, is that if we can't know that the future, if we don't know that the future will be like the past, then our being able to, like, test and replicate findings from the past would be basically, we wouldn't actually know that we're actually replicating something, because instead of one thing causing something in the present, so let's say in the past, it seemed that A caused B. And A was like some sort of like starting point, some sort of like pre-existing like situation or circumstance, and it caused B. But in the future, it's like, well, what if it looks like it causes B again? But if we don't know that the future is like the past, we don't know that some unknown constant might have fluctuated, and thus we don't know if it actually was the case that A caused B for a second time, rather than there's something unknown that may have changed because we don't know that the future wouldn't be like the past.
You're absolutely right. Science doesn't even attempt to answer those kinds of questions. Those are metaphysical questions. Let me try to explain using a different example. We can empirically verify the sun exists. We can go out and look at it. We can measure it. We can make testable predictions. But we could all be in the matrix. And so the sun may just be a bunch of ones and zeros. It doesn't exist at all. But the scientific predictions are the same. It doesn't make a difference if we're in the matrix. The scientific predictions are always going to be the same. So science doesn't care if the sun really truly exists or not. It makes no difference to science. Science only cares about the testable predictions. Now, whether those testable predictions are extendable to the fundamental nature of reality is irrelevant. Science just doesn't care. It's not something science is interested in. So you're right that we don't have a solution to the problem of induction, and science and logic could be fundamentally flawed and they could change throughout time, but that's a metaphysical question that science doesn't even attempt to answer. It's not relevant to the question because that's a different distinction.
But it would be relevant, because if you're using your standard to say like how the way we know things is by relying on the scientific method and what we can replicate, if the scientific method is unreliable and that we wouldn't know that the future would be like the past, then our findings today, we wouldn't know if there were, like, let's say we found, like I said, we get B as our outcome, and we say, okay, we got B, and it looks like it was A that caused this, just like A caused it yesterday. But like I said, if there's these unknown constants that could have changed between yesterday and today, that now we're like, oh no, maybe something else changed. We have to go recheck everything stayed the exact same from yesterday to today in terms of all these constants, like gravity or whatever else, like in terms of its force and pull, because it comes in degrees, obviously. So it's not like you could either have like zero gravity or a ton of gravity. It could change in very small ways, which could affect your results. So like if you don't know that that today is the same as it was yesterday with all those constants, like you'd have to recheck them all the time. Otherwise you couldn't know that you actually replicated like a cause and effect relationship. So it's, if it undermines science that way, like replication wouldn't even be useful for you knowing anything either. Like it would be no better than anything else, right?
I think you're conflating absolute truth with methodological truth. There's like you made this distinction earlier between the methodological and the metaphysical. You are bringing up a metaphysical criticism about absolute truth. We don't have absolute truth. We don't have absolute certainty. All science is tentative and provisional. So we have no idea if induction, things can change and the laws of physics can change. We don't know. Science doesn't attempt to answer this. It is only making the distinction between the stuff in our imagination and the stuff when we experience. Now, whether or not those stay the same, or they are fundamental nature of reality, or whether or not they are absolute capital T truth is just not a question science cares about. It doesn't make a difference.
But I'm not saying, though, that we need absolute truth or that science gets us like certainty. I'm saying that even coming to like the idea of like 90% probability about like what we replicated today compared to like 50-50, like in terms of like 50-50 confidence in terms of like, oh, did we actually replicate the causal effect of A on B today the same way that it occurred yesterday, is that we wouldn't even have a 50% probability, because if all these different constants are off in all these like tiny little directions in different ways, like you could actually, you'd have like, you wouldn't even be, it's not about certainty, it's like you wouldn't even be able to have strong confidence in your probabilities. So I'm not raising the bar that high to say we need certainty.
Well, any claim about metaphysics is a claim about certainty. So you are doing that. You just maybe you don't realize it. Let me try and explain it this way. Imagine all knowledge is like a vast expanse of rolling hills. Now we're standing on a hill, and every discovery is like climbing up the next hill to discover what's on top of the next hill. There's two really important hills here. One is the one we're standing on, and one is the final hill, where there's nothing more beyond it. There's nothing more to discover. Science doesn't care about anything beyond the hills that we're currently standing on. Like the final hill doesn't exist for science. Everything in science could be wrong. Science does not care. All that it cares about is the apparent stuff about the hill we are currently standing on. It could be a complete delusion. We could be in a matrix or a brain in the vat, or under some kind of created 5 minutes ago. There are lots of possibilities here, but those are all metaphysical possibilities. That is a completely different category. All science cares about is the apparent world that we see around us, that we can interact with. Now, whether or not this is true, or whether or not it extends to metaphysics, is completely irrelevant to science. Science does not care about metaphysics. Metaphysics is the realm of absolute certainty. Even if you're only trying to apply probabilities to it, it's just irrelevant to science. So whether or not we can apply this to know, like at a capital K, capital knowledge know, science just doesn't care.
Nobody ever said anything about a capital K, Tom. That, like, it sounds like you're strawmanning me now, because like I already explained to you, it's not about like knowing with certainty. I just said that. Like I'm starting to wonder like why you would bring up the capital K again. But the second thing is, we could say the exact same thing about both metaphysics and the empirical world. We could say there's a certainty about what is with regard to metaphysics, like the nature, like whether or not God exists, let's say, and we could say like there's a certainty about things in the empirical world, like whether or not, let's say, that this sweatshirt exists, like is, you know, it's made of atoms, and like, does it exist? Like, and then we can apply our probabilities to both. So like, it just seems so, like, if you understand what I'm saying, like, I'm saying that our probabilities about scientific truths, like I'm not even talking about I'm talking about like our confidence of how we know that, let's say, A caused B today, in the same way we think that A caused B yesterday. So like, there's nothing metaphysical about that. Like,
That is actually a metaphysical question.
Okay, well then every
pure
scientific
metaphysics.
paper, the scientific papers that I read every day in psychology, when we try to draw a causal inference, are metaphysical. And so all the scientific knowledge, Tom, that's what an experiment is that a true experiment holds all the other variables constant, so you can test the treatment or like the experimental conditions effect on an outcome relative to the control group. Like, that's a genuine, like a true experiment. And so if you're saying that that's metaphysical, then all of science is metaphysical, at least any sort of experimental, like causal, which is a huge proportion of almost any science. Is you're saying that that's all just metaphysical, which, if you want to do that, now it looks like it cuts out your case from underneath you again, because in this case you'd actually be like, your whole role is about replicating these findings, and all those findings that are replicated, many of them are experimental. They're about causation.
You're right. Those are all metaphysical, and those are part of science, and all of science agrees those are just assumptions. We have to assume all of that. We can't show it. We can't demonstrate it. We're not certain about it, and science does not care one bit. Not at all.
So they're metaphysical. We'd agree on that, right?
Yeah, the assumption that A caused B today also applies to the past and to the future. Yes, that's a metaphysical assumption. Science can't prove that. Science doesn't even care.
But we're not talking about like certainty, Tom. It's not about proving things. Like, that's not what I'm talking about. So I'm just talking about having strong evidence for a claim of causation. Like, that's what these scientific papers that talk about experiments are doing. And so I'm saying, though, if we cut out the idea that we can know like the future, like namely that A caused, or I should say, A caused B today. If we say, well, we know that it was actually A that caused B today, just like it did in the past. Like, that's using this assumption that we can't even have a 50% probability. It's not about knowing or certainty. It's that you don't even have like a 50% necessarily.
That's correct. Causation is itself a branch of metaphysics. The entire branch of causation, or causation itself, is a branch of metaphysics. And Hume doubted causation completely, and science just assumes causation. We can't prove it. We can't demonstrate it. Science does not care. It is completely irrelevant to science in its entirety. This is purely an apparent distinction, which means whether or not it's absolutely true is irrelevant. Science does not care about the metaphysics of whether or not causation is a true thing or not.
We don't. So that, all granting that, no problem. My point is that your epistemology, that namely you think that you can know things by replicating them through science. I'm saying that if you apply your method, your epistemology, and you apply it consistently to science, then you can't have any scientific, like, you can't have
certainty.
Evidence.
You can't have scientific certainty, but you still have
evidence.
Well, that's wrong.
You're the one that brought up the certainty. That's a straw man. I never ever said anything about certainty, Tom. I'm talking about just evidence, because you couldn't even have a 50% probability necessarily. Like, you'd just be like, well, we don't know if A caused B today the same way that it caused it yesterday, because we'd have to retest all the assumptions that we hold today that we just assume were the same since yesterday. And if we don't know if they're holding today unless we test them again, then we couldn't actually know that it's A causing B today the same way that it did yesterday. And so you couldn't have you couldn't even have strong scientific evidence, or even scientific evidence at all, because you'd be like, well, do we know that A caused B today the same way it did yesterday? We would just say, well, no, we don't. Like, we don't even know. It's like a 50-50. Who knows? We're not sure. And so you wouldn't have any knowledge, not even scientific knowledge. Does that make sense?
Only if you're defining knowledge as absolute certainty. Science does not care about that at all. So when you keep bringing this up, scientists everywhere agree with what I'm saying, 100%. We don't have a solution to the problem of induction. It's just an assumption. And does that mean that all science could be wrong? Absolutely. Do scientists care? Not one bit.
I'm saying we don't even have more than a 50% probability. We don't even know if we have that justification for saying that it's higher than a 50% probability. That's what I mean by knowledge. I never talked about certainty in this whole conversation.
That's because your reference point is the certainty perspective. You're trying to look at knowledge from a comparison point to that absolute certainty, whereas science doesn't care about that at all. Science's reference point to knowledge is how does A compare to B as far as we can tell. It doesn't make a difference if it's true, it's only an apparent difference. The truth relative to the absolute certainty, the fundamental nature of reality, is irrelevant to science. All that matters is a comparative analysis to what we can tell, what we can look at, the apparent world. That's it. So the truth is a category irrelevant to science. You're muted.
We're not, thank you. We're not talking, though, about, in terms of truth. When I say knowledge, I'm not saying, like, certainty. I'm not saying truth with a capital T. I just mean, like, knowledge in the sense of having, like, a high probability that strong evidence that something happened. And so I'm saying we can't even, if we don't even have higher than a 50% probability, we don't have anything. Because if something's, like, 50-50, we're like, well, we don't know if it just happened by random chance, namely that A caused B today, and we're actually replicating it compared to the way that A caused B yesterday. Like, we wouldn't even know that, and by no, I just mean we wouldn't even be able to have a 51% probability. We wouldn't be justified in saying we have a 51% probability that A caused B in the same way that it did yesterday. And so, in other words, you'd have no reason to differ from 50%, in which case you wouldn't have any scientific, like, evidence for anything.
So again, it depends on how you define probabilities. If you define the probability from a reference point of the fundamental truth or the absolute truth, which I know you're not specifically saying these words, but the topic you're talking about is necessitating those words. You're bringing up topics that require absolute truth and absolute knowledge, which science doesn't care about. So if you define probabilities based on those absolutes, then you're right. We can't have any reference point at all to know with any probability of anything being true or not. But science doesn't define knowledge or probabilities like that. It defines it from a bottom-up perspective. There is some difference between my imagination and my experience. Whether or not this is consistent doesn't make a difference. Whether or not it's true doesn't make a difference. Whether or not we're in a delusion doesn't make a difference. There is an apparent difference. It's when I imagine a unicorn, I do not see a unicorn. That is the starting point for science. And then from that point, we build up probabilities. We don't care about the absolute truth. We don't care about whether or not causation is a real thing or not. That is completely irrelevant. That's a metaphysical question about that absolute truth and that absolute certainty tier of knowledge.
Yeah, at this point, I'm honestly just like, you're just claiming, like, I could do the same thing without explaining it. I could just say, like, you're assuming absolute truth, Tom, by the way that you're talking about these things. All I was talking about was probabilities. Like, I never brought up absolute truth this whole time. I was just talking about whether or not we're justified in believing something is more likely than not. Period. That's it.
I understand what you're saying, but there's different ways of establishing probabilities. The way you are establishing probabilities is based on a reference point of absolute truth, which means you are correct. If we do that, then we can't establish probabilities for anything at all. We have no idea if causation is real, and so you're right, we have zero way to establish probabilities for anything. Science doesn't do that. It doesn't care about whether or not causation is real. It is irrelevant to science. It is an assumption.
No, so my claim wasn't that science, like, claims about causation being real. I'm saying that we wouldn't have any evidential merit for, like, changing our probabilities based on evidence, based on, like, scientific evidence in particular, because the scientific evidence, it wouldn't be useful for adjusting our probabilities. That's it.
Yeah, we just assume all of that. We have no evidence for it, so we're just going to assume it's true, and we're done. That's science's answer to that. If we assume it's true, we're done.
So we're talking, though, I mean, so you're willing to bite the bullet, and you're willing to say, like, yes, scientific evidence, we have no reason for it to influence our beliefs, our probability assessments of things in the world.
No. We assume it's true. So we're just going to say causation is real, it's consistent. We just assume it's universal, and we don't care whether or not this is correct or not. We're just going to assume it, and we're done. That's what science does. So we accept that it's real, and we say we do have reason to infer things about reality based on our empirical verifiability. But it's not because of empirical verifiability. We just assume the metaphysical part.
Okay, so basically, we've talked about, so you say, no, we can have reason to believe, we can have our probabilities are, it's fair to have we're rational in adjusting our probabilities according to the scientific evidence, because we assume these things, we assume certain things, like that the future will be like the past.
Yes, correct.
Get what you're saying there. Go ahead, you were going to say something.
No, I was just saying you're correct. That's absolutely right. You're on the right track.
Okay. Yeah, my thought is, you can't, like, applying your epistemology, though, it seems like it seems like you destroy having any reason to like base your evidence, or I should say your probabilities, on the evidence. It's your epistemology. Like, do you understand? Like, you don't understand like how I'm not using any sort of like absolute statements to like justify this or as a reference point?
Well, I think I really, really do understand what you're saying. The point is, the problem is, I'm not sure if I can make a comparative analysis to get you to see it from the same perspective. So all of science, every scientist agrees science is tentative, provisional, we assume causality, we can't prove it, we have no answers to these metaphysical questions, and we're just going to assume them. That's all science just agrees on that. We just assume this stuff is true and move on. We don't know it, we can't be certain about it. The problem of induction is a problem with all of science. We have no idea how to solve it, and science just assumes it's true and moves on.
Okay, so my thought is, I'm trying to remember where so originally my, I think, objection was I was saying that your epistemology gives us, so we don't have a reason to believe in scientific evidence and think that it influences our probabilities. And you're saying, no, it does, because we just assume. So why don't you apply, though, your standard of epistemology to other areas of life other than science? Like, why is it that, or I should say, my original accusation, and the same one that I still hold, is it doesn't seem like you are applying it consistently.
So there's 3 tiers of knowledge: conceptual, empirical, and metaphysical. Conceptual claims require conceptual evidence. It's like logic and math and imagination stuff. Empirical claims require empirical evidence. That's the testable predictions. And metaphysical claims require metaphysical evidence. That's the absolute certainty tier. So if we want a solution to the problem of induction, we need the metaphysical evidence. That is a different category. So empirical claims don't apply to that, because empirical evidence has nothing to do with metaphysics. We have to assume metaphysics to believe that empirical evidence actually works. So it's a different category.
So you're saying that, so the metaphysical, like empirical, is disconnected, and it just, I understand that they're different, but you would probably concede that some things that are different can still like apply to each other or influence each other, or be reason to think that, if 2 things are different, you can know something about A, to think that, to reasonably draw inference about something in terms of your thoughts about B. You'd think that's possible, right? Or do you think that's never possible? Okay, so
absolutely it is. But I'm making the claim that the empirical and the metaphysical are completely distinct, kind of like the square root of a pork chop. They are just 2 different categories, and no amount of empirical evidence can ever indicate anything metaphysical. Like, we can never solve the problem of induction with empirical evidence. We can never solve the problem of underdetermination with empirical evidence. We can never solve Agrippa's trilemma. We can never solve a whole bunch of problems. We can never prove we're not in the matrix with empirical evidence. We can never prove we're not a brain in the vat with empirical evidence. We can never prove we weren't created 5 minutes ago with empirical evidence. These are just not things that empirical evidence can solve, because empirical evidence is contingent on those things being assumed not to be the case.
So there's empirical, conceptual, and metaphysical. Can you tell me what the conceptual one is?
Stuff in our head, just imaginary, math, logic, intuition, personal experience, stuff like that. Actually, I had just thought of something. Let me put it this way. Do you know metaphysical naturalism?
Yes.
So it's the position that there is absolutely no supernatural anywhere. Now, that's not supported. No amount of empirical evidence can support metaphysical naturalism, because there could always be more that we haven't discovered yet. There could always be a supernatural out there that we just have yet to discover. So no amount of empirical evidence can support metaphysical naturalism.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So does that have to do with the conceptual?
No, I was just going back to the other point because it popped into my head.
Okay, gotcha. So this is something that I've heard more than once. I'm still wrapping my head around your epistemology. Not to say that there's anything wrong with it. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm not trying to imply that. It's that it's new to me, still grasping it. And just so I can like recap and see like from where we started. I think you had said when it comes to knowing about whether or not things exist that are metaphysical, like let's say a god, you could only know that it is real if you had scientific evidence.
Not quite.
If it was replicate by scientific evidence, I mean if you could replicate it.
Scientific is the empirical tier, so we could have a reason to believe God empirically exists if we had empirical evidence. So if we had testable predictions, like I prayed to a God, he gave me a gold brick. I prayed to a God again, he gave me a gold brick, and this was a repeatable prediction. We could show that we have a reason to believe there is a powerful being in the apparent world we could experience around us. But that doesn't prove any of the metaphysical properties of a God, like that he's all powerful or all knowing or omniscient or all good. All of those properties are kind of like metaphysical naturalism. To know that a God is like the only God, you'd have to prove that there is absolutely no other God anywhere in all of the universe, which would be like the same of proving that there is no supernatural anywhere, no matter what. And no amount of empirical evidence can indicate that property of God. But if we had empirical evidence, like testable predictions of a gold brick, that would be sufficient to believe the empirical properties of God, that he exists and is a powerful being in some respect.
Okay, so if I understand right, the nature of God would be off limits. It would be metaphysical, but the existence of God is something that you could show through empirical, replicated evidence.
Yes.
The way I had remembered is that like God's existence would be a metaphysical claim, though, given that it's metaphysical, like beyond the physical, like he's an incorporeal mind.
Well, metaphysical doesn't just mean beyond the physical. That would just be supernatural or superphysical or something.
Right.
Metaphysical means it's the
it was the exclusive meaning of it.
Well, I don't think it is a meaning of it. Because from my perspective, metaphysical means the first principles or the fundamental nature of reality. So it's like a stopping point where there's nothing beyond it to go further. So if there is only one God, there is absolutely no supernatural. There are many gods. There is only the fundamental pantheism, the super all-powerful universe. They are stopping points for truth where there is nothing more beyond it. That's metaphysical. First principles, absolutes, absolute certainty, those kinds of things. Empirical is just what we can see, what we can verify, but it isn't necessarily true. Like we can verify the sun, but it could be a part of the matrix. So it could be empirically verifiable that the sun exists, so it is empirically true, but we're metaphysically in the matrix, so it is metaphysically false.
So when you say that, like, it would be a metaphysical claim that there's only one God, and the significance there is that you're saying there's only one God rather than there is a God. You're saying that's what makes it a metaphysical claim.
Yes, because there could, even if there is one God, there could still be more gods. There could be a more powerful God, or that God could have been created by a different God. So that isn't necessarily a metaphysical question to say there is a God. It would only be metaphysical if you apply absolute properties to it, like all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, the only God. Kind of like with metaphysical naturalism, there is only the natural world. It's only metaphysical if it has a stopping point for truth and there's nothing beyond it.
So, it seems like the reason that in addition to the metaphysical meaning beyond physical, like that, I do think that is one form of metaphysics. And one reason I say that is just the law, or I should say just if we just have the disjunction between empirical, metaphysical, and conceptual, where does God fit if he's not in the metaphysical? Like, you're going to put him in either empirical or conceptual, which as you defined conceptual earlier, things just in your head. And if it's just in your head, that's begging the question for atheism, or namely, like, then of course, using your epistemology, nothing could ever be evidence for God because you've already begged the question that he doesn't exist. He's just an idea in the head, or you have to bite the bullet and say that he's empirical. He's something that you could empirically, like the same way that I can hold like a phone, let's say, like, obviously, God's not empirical, though. So now it seems like you're on the horns of a major dilemma.
I'm not sure I follow, because God could be any of these three. Like, God could be conceptual, which means he's only in our head, or God could be empirical, in which case he's kind of like a computer programmer. He's just a guy who designed the universe and has the power to do stuff, but he isn't the fundamental nature of reality. He could have been created by another God or something. And God could be metaphysical, meaning he is the absolute truth, the stopping point of everything, the origin of everything. So God could be any of these three. I don't make an assumption one way or the other purely based on my epistemology.
But earlier you had said that like you said, that there's only one God, that's a metaphysical claim. But the idea that there is a God, that's not a metaphysical claim. But not so. In other words, you wouldn't be able to say that God, the question of God's existence is a metaphysical question. Like,
Well, it depends on how you phrase the question. You can make any question could be in any of these three tiers. So, for example, if I said, I am holding an apple, if I'm holding an apple in my imagination, that's conceptual. If I'm holding an apple in the apparent world around us, that's empirical. And if I'm holding the world in the fundamental true nature of reality, that's metaphysical. So any question could be phrased in any one of these tiers. It doesn't prioritize or assume God is of any particular one. The kind of God that you believe in would absolutely be metaphysical because you assume he has all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, those kinds of things, I believe.
okay. And so this seems different. I could have sworn, like, just a little while ago you had said that, like, just no, like, the question of God's existence is not a metaphysical one, and now you're saying, like, oh, actually it could be. So, like, that's why I'm confused.
Oh, I apologize, because I'm an atheist, so I don't believe in a particular God. So God could mean lots of different things. Like you could have a polytheistic God, which is just one of many gods. Like in Hinduism, where there's gods that were created by a different God, and so those many gods would not be metaphysical. The big ultimate God, the Brahman, would be the metaphysical. So it depends on what you mean by God. In your case, as a theist, I believe you would mean God to be metaphysical. So if God existed and had the property of being all-powerful, that would be a metaphysical kind of a God.
Well, I totally appreciate your ideas, and I would suggest to our moderator, just because I'll defer to John, I have to meet somebody in like 22 minutes. If we're able to move to the Q&A, if we don't have questions, we could come back and we could keep having the dialogue. But
can we go back to Joseph if Joseph had anything else to say first?
Yeah.
Also, I'll just say real quick, if anyone does have questions, please tag me in them because I haven't gotten any tags yet, but I'm still looking. So, yeah, if you do have any questions, I'll just put them in the side box and we'll get them to the Q&A at the very end. But yeah, we'll get to Joseph right now.
I'd just like to start to ask you a question. Do you believe that your God has an effect on reality in any way?
That God has an effect on reality in what way?
In any way.
Let's see. By effect, we would just mean like let's say whether or not he intervenes for like a miracle, right?
Absolutely anything. Like, yeah, miracle is a good example.
I think I haven't observed one myself, but I think it wouldn't be beyond. I know he for sure has in the past. So like I think he rose Jesus from the dead. So for sure in that case, I'd have to say whether or not he does miracles today, like I'm not sure, but he for sure has. I have no doubt he has in the past in terms of my worldview.
Why do you believe that he has done that?
Though Tom's epistemology is respectable, it's not one that I share. And so for me, like historical evidence, well, so there's the initial like cumulative case for a God, like that I would use more philosophical arguments to try to build the case. And then once you have that, the probability that the historical evidence is indicative of God having risen Jesus from the dead is much higher compared to if you didn't have that initial case. The initial case would be like the moral argument would be a starting point for thinking there's a God, and then from there you build.
All right, so you said historical evidence. Exactly what kind of historical evidence are you relying on?
So the main criteria from historical methods would be like independent sources. So you'd want sources that were like they claim to have seen the same thing, like relatively speaking, but even though they might not have agreed on it. So for example, like as an example of like maybe they wouldn't agree in the details, you had some people that thought the Titanic split before it went down, and you had some people who said like, no, the Titanic just went down as one, and if it split, if you found it at the bottom of the ocean split, it was after it already sunk. Like they disagree on like details, and this one a big detail. But then nonetheless, they both claimed without having talked to each other beforehand that the Titanic went down. So like that would be one example of like independent evidence or testimony. Where
do these testimonies come from? Are they just from the Bible, or did people just write them down at random?
So they were compiled eventually by Christians and considered scripture, but it wouldn't change the fact that they are like historical accounts.
All right. So, even though it is historical and you claim to have not seen anything like that now, right? I'll go back to the question that I asked before. How exactly can you rely on that if you've never had an example of that happen in the present day?
So I think your question, if I understood right, sorry, it's just that I'm like processing a lot. If I haven't seen it in the past, or I'm sorry, if I haven't seen it today, like how can I be justified in believing that it happened in the past? So there are, like, I don't see why you couldn't do that. I don't see any reason why you couldn't. And I think that there are things that, like, we say, we don't see certain things today in, like, the very, like, literal sense. So, like, we don't see, you could have evidence of, like things lingering from the past. So I don't see dinosaurs alive today, but if I see dinosaur bones,
But
like,
we have
I think
physical evidence for dinosaurs having existed in the past.
yeah, and we have physical evidence in the form of information, which I guess is, like, you guys being naturalists would probably say that information itself even would be physical somehow, namely through the documents of the New Testament.
What do you mean by information?
Yeah, I'm not sure how you guys would characterize this, but the accounts, like the testimonies of having seen. So, for example, you have.
How can we demonstrate that these testimonies are reliable, though?
So you use different criterion from historical methods, like the criterion of dissimilarity, or the criterion of, some people would use criterion of embarrassment. Some would say it's not. That one's, I admit, that one's debated. And then you might look for, like, reasons that it wouldn't give you, like, strong reason to believe it, but it would at least be disconfirming if you found that, oh, look, they look like they're biased, like they look like they have, like, something to gain from this. In that case, you'd actually say, okay, then it's less trustworthy.
Okay. What else? I don't really have a lot. What personal experiences have you had that led you to believe in the God?
My personal experiences haven't been, like, super strong reasons that I've come to believe. I think that they're, like, confirming once you have the evidence in place, because if they weren't there, like, so for example, if I have a cumulative case, like an intellectual case that I think, like, oh, okay, it does seem to be, like, reasonable to think that God exists, then after that, like, once you have that, the experience might count for a small part of evidence. But I'm, like, this is Richard Swinburne's idea, by the way, not mine, so I don't want to take credit for it. And there are probably other reasons, other things I've said tonight that were not mine, that I probably should have given credit to the author, but I don't remember the author. But basically, if you don't, so, like, let's say I don't have any intellectual case for a God, then it's like, I'm not sure if I'm entitled in saying that my experience, my presumed experience of a God, is, like, evidence for it, until actually after you have, like, an intellectual case. So for me, it's kind of like a small reason, but by itself it wouldn't be enough reason for me to believe, probably, I think.
All right. If I remember right, the question initially posed in the debate was, does the Bible and the God of the Bible have more proof than the other religions out there, if I might add? So, what evidence can you present to that exactly?
Yeah, so
yeah, okay. Go ahead.
good question. So for me, historical methods, like, are, if they're part of a broader philosophical argument, they are one way in which we can have evidence for an idea, like a reason to believe it. So for me, I give the historical case for the resurrection. And when I look at other religious texts, there are different problems I see. One is, oftentimes they don't even make, like, historical claims of things that actually happened. They're more like claims purely about what some might consider metaphysical. And then in some cases, they're making claims that don't have the same kind of quality of evidence for them. So, for example, independent sources. So, for example, like the Quran. The Quran talks about Muhammad's ascension, and unfortunately, Muslims would say that all of the Quran was written by Muhammad himself, which is only one independent source. Now, if you had, like, let's say, theoretically, if you have the first half and the second half written by two different people for the Quran, like this is a hypothetical world. If you had the first half and the second half written by two different people, and they both talked about Muhammad's ascension, that would be more evidence for his ascension, because we'd say, okay, now we have two independent sources. So I would be consistent, and I would say, like, yeah, we have, and it wouldn't be like as much, because remember, we have three facts for the Christian case for the resurrection, and and not only that, but we oftentimes have more than two independent sources for each of those three facts. So it's but that would give you an example of like why I don't believe it. Other times there's like disconfirming evidence, like Oliver Cowdery was a Muslim, or not a Muslim, sorry, Mormon, who seemed to abandon the faith. Unlike the original disciples, we don't seem to have evidence of them having left the faith, but we do have one of the disciples of Joseph Smith, Oliver Cowdery, who appeared to abandon the faith. And so it would be kind of disconfirming of Mormonism, even if it did have as strong of a case as Christianity in those other ways, such as independent attestation.
All right. But that still doesn't quite answer the question, as that was, why do you think that Christianity has more evidence than any other religion out there? Because I'm not really seeing how any of this evidence is particularly verifiable in any way.
So I think there's maybe two issues there, but just so I make sure I understand you right. So I think maybe you're just trying to you're like, well, you're saying we can't verify the evidence for Christianity. Like, are you saying we can't verify that there are independent sources that like wrote these? Because like if Christianity has more independent sources that attest to its miracles, then the evidence for its miracles would be higher compared to other religions. Like, and are you saying we don't have a way of verifying that there were like independent writers of these sources?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that even if you had independent sources, how could you confirm that those experiences were even real?
So I think you mean like, by real, do you mean relative to if they were like, what would the alternate? You mean like?
I think he means like, testable predictions.
Yes, exactly.
So I don't understand how that is so if you say, how do you verify that they're real?
Have we ever seen an example of a miracle today that could confirm what the supposed independent sources have said happened?
I would give the same response I gave before, namely that though we don't have direct like replicated evidence of like the same way we don't have like living dinosaurs now, we have evidence of past living dinosaurs.
We have fossils.
I know, that's why I said we have evidence of past living dinosaurs, and that's why we believe in those past living dinosaurs having existed, in the same way that we have historical documents, or in some cases historical arguments that give us reason to believe that those events occurred in the past, even though we don't see them occurring in a you could say in a live way today.
But the difference between those two, I think one of the more important differences between those two, is when things die today, we see bones, right? That's about that bit about fossils. But we don't see people resurrect from the dead today.
So my original claim was just that those three facts were true, and we do have like evidence for those. And then from there, it's a philosophical argument arguing for that conclusion. But I mean, would you contest one of the three facts that I explained?
I'm just saying, if they happened, why do you believe that it's reasonable to believe that they happened, for one thing?
I think they're reasonable to believe based on the historical methodology that I explained, namely if we have independent sources and then we have criterion of dissimilarity for some of them, or criterion of embarrassment, that gives you good reason to believe the three facts, and the fact that the majority of scholars believe in those three facts. And the statement, like you could say the more philosophical statement, that there are no natural explanations that explain those three facts, as well as the explanation that God rose Jesus from the dead.
Okay, you claim that you have evidence for the resurrection and stuff like that, right? Let's use the same argument. Okay? The Jesus of the Bible or whoever was, I'm not very good with Bible, so I'm sure too hard on this, said that if you pray hard enough, you can make stuff like mountains jump from where they are into the ocean, right? We can test that right now and prove that that is false, right?
Yeah,
So
if that were what he literally, if he meant that in the way that we're interpreting it.
So how am I supposed to believe that somebody who died for 3 days, he somehow got up and went to heaven after people saw him walking around after apparently being dead for 3 days, and that we don't really see very much outside of the Bible to really, how do you say, confirm this?
Well, the fact that, like, whether or not historical documents are outside of the Bible or not, I think that New Testament documents, even though they were compiled later on by Christians decades later and considered scripture, like, it wouldn't change the fact that they're like historical accounts of what happened at that time. So, like, the fact that they were like part of the Bible, like considered scripture later on by Christians or not, is like seems to be an arbitrary detail. Like, it's not. It's hard to see how it weighs on whether or not it's evidence.
Okay, so you're saying that, what is that? Okay, is there anything that isn't in the Bible that could confirm this? Like, like the Romans were around during that time, right? Is there any contemporary Roman writers of the era that claim that these people came back from the dead during that day? Because I think, if I remember right, that Jesus wasn't like the only person that came back from the dead. Do you think that somebody would write back to the home country that this was going on?
By Romans, do you mean like non-Christian Romans or Christian ones?
Either or. Like, did anybody write back to the emperor or whatever at the time that people were coming back from the dead and visiting their hometowns and relatives?
I'm not sure, like, you could say, like, the status of all the writers of the epistles in the New Testament, namely, like, whether or not they have Roman status or not. I mean, Paul actually did have Roman citizenship, and so, like, yeah, you do have one Roman there who is writing about Jesus having resurrected.
Did he claim to have seen it firsthand, though?
Yeah, on the road to Damascus.
Oh, yeah, I mean, in person, somebody rising from the dead. Did he claim to see that?
He didn't claim to see like a physical body. He had heard a voice, like the voice of Christ, and I think that I can't remember exactly what he saw with his eyes. I know it was like he saw something that was irregular, like a flash of light, I think, and I can't remember after that.
Okay. So, I don't know. I think that's pretty much all I wanted to ask on that. You have anything else you'd like to ask or anything?
No, I'm good.
Thanks for your guys' patience. I know that, especially, I'm sorry, Tom, that you could tell I was like flustered at one point, but it's like, it's like, we're good. I hope you know that I love you, man. I love both you guys. I love your guys' ideas. I appreciate that you bring them here. And I'm so sorry. I was just like, I think it was just like maybe I wasn't grasping what you were saying, or maybe there was a misunderstanding in either direction. And so I was like, thanks for your patience on when I'm like, no, Tom.
You never have to worry about it. I'm here for the debate. I love debate, and hearing your responses to my ideas helps me to really learn how to phrase them better. So I can't be more thankful to how willing you are to listen to my ideas, even though they are very critical of your position. So thanks.
Oh yeah, thanks. That means a lot to me. I appreciate your kind words. That means a lot. And also thank you. I totally appreciate you being willing to take the time, Joseph. Like, I know it's busy, and so both of you, I appreciate it, especially on New Year's Eve, to join this party. It means a lot. I'm glad you guys are here, and that we can have like a civil discussion like this. This is really, I just feel really encouraged. I'd rather be here than anywhere else for my New Year's Eve, and I'm dead serious about that. Like, this is like the highlight of my day when I get to be here. So thank you guys.
Oh yeah, thank you. This is my first debate, so I'd like to thank you too. So.
Oh yeah, it's my pleasure. Like, come back anytime. We're happy to have you. And John, sorry, in case you have questions, John, I didn't mean to wrap up early, but in case you have questions?
Oh no, that's totally all right. I mean, I honestly only think one of the questions was, and we appreciate all the questions, but only one of them was relevant to the debate. And it basically was, it was to all participants, and the question was, what evidences are there for religions other than Christianity, which I think is an interesting thing to throw into the mix. That was the most relevant question, so I figured I'd ask that one. The other ones are in the side in case anyone wants to be a hero, but you know, just let me know.
Well, I'll start with that one because my answer is pretty easy. I disagree with what James said earlier. I think there is exactly the same evidence for all the religions, which is zero, not a bit.
I'll also go as far to agree with that statement. I mean, if we're holding everything to the same standard of evidence, I mean, a lot of religions have books, a lot of religions have claims and personal experiences, and if you hold everything to the same standard as Christianity from a Christian perspective, then you really have to ask yourself, why don't I just believe everything? So that's my thoughts on that.
I think that they're consistent with their epistemology. That makes sense to me, why you'd think there's like literally the same for everything.
I guess that pretty much answers it. Is there anything else you guys want to talk about for now?
I'll do.
That more or less wraps it up.
Go ahead.
If you got more time, I wanted to know what you meant by information. You said information.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely. I love that.
I've got 1 minute. Like I've got to do like a couple of quick house cleaning things, just to talk about the channel. One is that TJump and our friend Joseph, our new friend Joseph, we're excited that you're here. They're both going to be on January 11th, and it's going to be very similar. We might have actually, it's going to be different in a way. This is a Lion's Den where it's just like, you know, we're all going, and then we're doing something brand new called the Elimination Chamber. And it's honestly, you guys have no idea how excited I am because we're incorporating a WWE idea into the channel. And with that, you know, feel free, if you're new here, we're glad you're here. We love your ideas. No matter, and I would say, yeah, like we love diversity of thought. So you know, we want people of different views to be here. It sharpens us in our thinking. It challenges us, and it gets us to like think more. And so hit that subscribe button if you want reminders of future debates. And so hopefully we can get to see you again and have your ideas here again. And also, moderndaydebate.com that's down in the description box. There's a calendar, and Tom helped me get the calendar straightened out because the other day when I announced it, I think it was yesterday, I didn't realize that it was on private. Now it's on public. You can look at the calendar. If there are any topics you'd love to debate, let us know. We would love to have you come on. There's some that are highlighted, and those are the ones that are still waiting for another person to enter the debate, but we already have one. And then there are some that they're written in already, and that means it's not highlighted. It's all done and set in stone. So email me at moderndaydebate@gmail.com and let me know if you'd like to be in one of those. And so also, everybody's links, John, our moderator, as well as Joseph and TJump's, they're in the description. So even if you don't agree with them, and no matter what their views are relative to yours, I encourage you to check them out because you can understand their view on a deeper level. And that way you're engaging with the other side, and it's not just like, well, what do people on my side say that those guys are saying? It's like, no, you can go and get to hear them yourself. So I highly encourage you to do that. Expose yourself to tough ideas and challenging ideas. And with that, I want to say thanks to the debaters so much for getting in the hot seat with me, and I appreciate it. Thanks for having me. I always enjoy coming on and talking with you. Thank you. Yeah, it's encouraging for both of you. And then thank you, Jonathan, for moderating. And thanks for your questions out there. Thank you for participating in the comments. So glad you were here. And with that, I will sign us out. So keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable. We'll see you tomorrow night. Kent Hovind versus Inspiring Philosophy. It's going to be epic, you guys. It's like, I hope you guys will be there, and it's going to be crazy. So have a great night, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.